Started here. Let's see. Welcome to the Thursday, the October 1st edition of the Thursday Night Educational Series. As we have said in previous sessions, this is not a tiled meeting. I just turned on the record. Also, please keep yourself on mute during the presentation. You're going to unmute temporarily using the space bar. And if you want to send a question in, please use the chat feature and we'll cover them at the end. There will also be a post for a survey through the chat at the end of the session. We have a couple more left here. We have Enoch coming up next week, and then we have the Minneapolis Valley introduction being put on October 15th. And following that, we will slip into our reunion degree cycle through the rest of the until November. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Brother Hans. Brother Hans, it's all yours.
Yep, thank you. I'm looking forward actually to meet Enoch. The way you stated it sounds almost like he's going to visit us personally here, right?
Well, you never know.
That would be delightful. So, okay, let's see here. Start presentation. Okay, can everybody see this?
No, I don't see anything on the presentation.
Okay, so then we need to do something else here. Now you should be seeing something.
Yes, we do. Yes,
there you go. There you go. Okay, welcome to What About the Third Eye, that's lovingly also called the pineal gland and pinecone. And unlike many other presentations, I've inserted a little disclaimer, obviously, and as usually, it's in very small print, so you can't read it, and generally people browse over it. But I will extend the courtesy of briefly explaining why I do this, and certainly in the context of this kind of esoteric topic, and that is that the materials that I will be presenting are not necessarily reviewed or explicitly reviewed by the Education Committee, Scottish Rite, or any Masonic body. So what I'm going to present is basically what you're going to find if you would search it yourself, minus the bogus that is surrounding the third eye. So I cannot speak for the integrity of all the statements I'm going to make. I've fact-checked them to the best of my knowledge. And given that political debates are kind of not subject to that very same restriction, I thought I could get by with it as well. So the presentation tonight is exclusively for the pleasure and the entertainment of you guys. With that said, let's dive in. So the third eye, why is it associated with the pineal gland and the pinecone? And for that, we're going to dive into our medicine and take a look at this. And the pineal gland, let me see if I get my laser going. Pineal gland is actually a tiny little endocrine gland that sits dead smack in between the two halves of the brain. It's not part of the brain, it just sits there. And it's shaped actually like a pine cone. And that's where it got its name from as well, because our pine cone translated into pinea, and hence the name pineal gland. And it is through a couple of ganglia connected directly to the eye. And from a top level perspective, its primary function is really regulating bodily functions. And the way it does this is it responds to light and then controls the release of certain hormones. And that's where it got its name from too, meaning the third eye, because under the influence of light, it basically starts doing things. And we're going to dive into what that is. So if there's no light, it releases a substance called melatonin, which makes us sleepy and kind of makes us want to rest. However, if there is light, then it inhibits actually the release of melatonin and releases a serotonin, which makes us feel active and causes awakening. So can you, sorry, there are people in the waiting room. Are you taking care of them?
I got it, don't worry about it.
Okay, got it. So, and those that are traveling across timelines know the potency of melatonin, or if you need to adjust to a new time zone, our melatonin is readily available in grocery stores, and it's a fantastic aid kind of to bridge our time zones and get accustomed to the circadian rhythm in that particular time zone. So that's what are, in essence, and this is something that science knew already for a long time, but that's one of the primary functions where what the pineal gland does, and hence where it got its name third eye from. Now it also plays a role in regulating reproduction, but we'll dive into that a little bit later. Now, what else does it do? And for that, we have to go to the soft sciences. And the reason I call it the soft sciences is that mainstream, our academic medicine might not always agree with everything that is coming out of those disciplines. But let's take a look at the role of the pineal gland in meditation. And what we do know is that when you meditate, the brain emits some high frequency waves. And they're generally they're called gamma waves, and they're in the 30 to 100 hertz range, and they increase physical activity and mental awareness. Now, the pineal gland has also some piezo electric call it properties, and then when these brain waves are interfering with the pineal gland, it triggers the pituitary gland, and you see that down here in this little picture. And the pituitary gland increases the blood flow. So what happens if you combine these two effects, you really solicit a higher state of awareness and receptiveness, as well as the ability to interact. So that's kind of the science behind our meditation and the role that the pineal gland plays in this. Then, let me do something here, 1 second. So recently, the pineal gland has also been associated with the secretion of DMT, and we'll get a little bit more in detail. It's also well known that not only humans have pineal glands, but actually most animals do have a pineal gland. And it's suggested through research that it facilitates instincts and by and large reproduction. So the pineal gland in animals keeps track about the length of the day, the shortening and the lengthening of the days, and animals time their reproduction according to that. There's also some quite fascinating data that is emerging out of a veterinary institute in Australia, where the piezoelectric properties that we talked about earlier seem to facilitate communication amongst birds, which was kind of a novel kind of a concept. And just keep that in mind when we start looking into the long history in around the pineal gland or the third eye. Now, the pineal gland has always played a very significant role in the various religions, and mostly the Eastern religion. And I'm going to touch on some of them. I'm not pretending here to be an expert in any of those, but I think it's definitely, in the context of our discussion, worth mentioning. So first, we know Hinduism, right? Where the pineal gland is viewed as the upper chakra, the sixth chakra, and it is used to access a higher degree of consciousness by exchanging energy through that chakra with the surroundings, as well as exchanging, meaning intaking as well as releasing. Buddhism views the third eye as gaining a perception of a reality that is generally beyond ordinary vision, and it's done for the purpose of obtaining wisdom. Taoism, whose principal themes are that the world is a place of vibration, and as is any individual, and the exchange of that vibration with the universe happens through the pineal gland, or also called the upper dantian. And even as old as in Central and Southern America, amongst the Mayan, Olmecs, and Aztecs, our pineal gland, or the third eye, I should say, played a significant role in balancing the material and the spiritual world to achieve a union of dualities. And even in Christianity, despite its kind of rigorous efforts to eradicate any pagan or pre-Christian beliefs, does recognize the concept of the all-seeing eye, and depends on what Christian fraction you are, it's either viewed as the all-seeing eye, or God is watching over humanity, or it signifies his omnipresence. And in the Bible, we see obviously the concept of light being the cause of the creation of matter. But also there's a quote from, or made by Jesus Christ, is that the light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. Sounds pretty much like the Eastern religion, but now, in all fairness, you see that the Pope is holding a staff with a pine cone. There's this massive pine cone dead center into the Vatican, but the Vatican takes a stance on the pine cone and says it's not directly related to the third eye. It really, the pine cone represents the seeding of God's teaching, because the pine cone is known as spreading a lot of seed. So be it as it may, but frankly, we see these symbols like the third eye, the pine cone, also in the religion, in the Christian religion. So with that, let's take a look at the mysterious and long history of the pine cone. And the first thing you see here is a picture of the eye of Horus. On the left-hand side, it's engraved. And on the right-hand side, you see a cross-section of the brain. This is actually a true anatomical structure. And if you kind of overlay them, what is kind of surprising is that the anatomical structure of the pineal gland and the symbolism used for the eye of Horus are nearly a perfect match. And one could sort of wonder how 2,000 years ago they had such fundamental understanding of the anatomy, but moreover, why they attributed such deep meaning to the third eye, to call it the eye of Horus. Now, for those that are familiar with Mesopotamian and Sumerian kind of a mythology, recognize here the god Marduk with a pine cone. And Marduk was actually attributed to almost kind of a single-handedly turn Mesopotamian civilization around from a bunch of hunter and gatherers to one of the largest civilization, the most advanced civilization in around the 11th and 12th century. The Greek and the Roman also had an affinity with the pine cone, and here you see Dionysus as the Greek and his Roman equivalent, Bacchus, are carrying the thyrsus topped with a pine cone. And the initiates in the Dionysian mystery, as well as the Eleusinian mysteries, got taught the significance of the pine cone in becoming enlightenment. And then last but not least, we see the caduceus that's kind of dating back about 4000 BC. And while there is a plurality of different interpretation, I think most of them settle on the whole concept that the central rod represents the axis mundi, or the connection between earth and heaven. The snakes are the guardians of this interchange. And the cone actually is the gateway through which this wisdom is descended and brought to humans. And the central figure that plays in there was obviously Hermes as the messenger of the gods. By the way, this is a picture of on the Whitehall building in New York City. I've actually seen it. It's a fabulous engraving. So in more recent history, we see Plato, where he in the Republic, 375 BC, states that in every man there is an eye of the soul, which is far more precious than 10,000 bodily eyes, for by it alone is truth seen. So he had kind of a fundamental understanding, not unlike what we see in the Eastern philosophies and religions. So, and then more recently, during the period of Renaissance and early Enlightenment period, we run across René Descartes. He was a 17th century mathematician and philosopher. And just kind of as a little bit of a background, during the Renaissance, this was the age of discovery, where people started really latching on to the idea through reason and rationalization, we can explain everything around us. The world is no longer mystic, but with the modern sciences that we now have discovered, we have finally found the means of explaining everything what's happening around us. And obviously, he started asking himself the question then, well, if that is true, if through rationalization I can really figure out what's happening around me, then where in the body are the thoughts formed? And where is the soul located? And there's a fascinating treatise I can share with you, a couple of articles, but obviously the exploration of the body as what the bodily functions are and what's the rationalization for any given function, where he kind of start narrowing it down, where he says that everything in our body exists out of dualities, right? So we have two arms, we have two eyes, we have two ears, etc., etc. And they're all representing duality. But what we do know is that soul is not a duality, it's a union. So he started digging through bodies and God knows what, and finally came across the pineal gland. And he said that's the only organ in the body that is not represented in some form of duality. So, and he recognizes that the optical nerve was connected to the pineal gland, and he was the one who first framed really that the pineal gland must therefore be the principal seat of the soul, and that's also the location where thoughts are formed. So it's kind of a fascinating concept, and I really encourage you to read a little bit more about it. It's not just the fact that how he came about this, but how the world was thinking at that point in time. So there's also some weird history, and frankly, the internet is full of it, but I took only the most entertaining one that had some credibility. So we do know that Hitler was pretty strict in kind of eradicating everything that was not aligned with his thinking or his body's thinking, but we do know that he had a fascination with what he called the magic side. And in his thinking, the pineal gland was basically the remnant of the single eye of the Cyclops. And when you discover its mystical properties, you could create and get the perception of the infinite. And obviously with that active foresight and the power, you can, without any weaponry, kind of conquer the world. And so what is shown here in this picture is his work desk, and it's ornamented, and here you see a detail of it with some kind of a Greek god with some rods and basically the pine cone on top of it. And that's probably also the reason why they spent an inordinate amount of time rummaging around in Egypt and trying to discover all the secrets that the Egyptians apparently had in having supernatural powers and the like. So speaking of Egypt, skull binding to elongate the head was commonly practiced amongst Egyptian royalty and priests. Now, some of them are the Egyptologists claim this was more or less done for fashion purposes, but I think there is an equal, if not more, evidence around the fact that this was done to increase the size of and the circulation around the pineal gland. It was also thought that if you make the skull larger and widen it, your brain will grow through, so you have increased intelligence, and you obtain visionary and seeing capabilities, something that was not only in high demand, but basically expected from the Egyptian priest to predict the futures and being the visionaries amongst them. Surprisingly, not until very recently, this practice of skull binding was still practiced among certain tribes in Africa. So it was kind of an interesting one. So let's turn our eye to the third eye in Masonry, where we recognize it as the all-seeing eye of deity. It's predominantly depicted here on George Washington's apron. We also find it on the dollar bill as the eye of providence. And while that's not necessarily a Masonic thing, although some anti-Masonic initiatives would claim that Masons are the culprit of everything, including taking over the world, but we see it there too. And this cannot be a Scottish Rite webinar without evoking the wisdom of our brother Albert Pike, who, when reflecting on the meaning of the third eye stated the following: the all-seeing eye was the emblem of Osiris, the creator. The yod in the center, and he's referring to the letter ayin, meaning eye, has the Kabbalistic meaning of the divine energy manifested as light and creating the universe. Now, as with any sentence from Albert Pike, you have to read it 2 or 3 times to really understand the meaning. He also said that up to the 19th century, the pinecone was actually on top of the deacon's rod, where it was associated with Hermes being the messenger of the gods. And frankly, if you think about it, the deacons in our lodges serve as messengers between the officers. So that makes sense. I don't want to go as far as saying that the officers are representing in any form or fashion the gods, but you certainly can see that the deacon's role is here well represented. This changed, and I couldn't find why this was changed, but actually at some point in time, some authority felt that was no longer appropriate. Now, if we look at a lot of Masonic depiction, we always see that the eye is generally placed in center and on top of any Masonic kind of either engraving or picturing a picture or whatsoever. And as Masons, we, as other people as well, navigate our life through opposing choices. And we have a lot of symbolism in the lodge that speaks to that. We have the checkerboard, right? We have Boaz Yakin, the opposing. So frankly, it's a central theme within Masonry. And the eye in these kind of depiction is always presented as the guiding principle that helps us obtain balance. Or expressed slightly more fanciful is that the eye is where opposites unite and duality transcends. I'm doing time-wise. I need to speed it up a little bit. But so we cannot speak about the pineal gland, third eye, without talking about a hotly debated topic, and that is the calcification of the pineal gland. So this is how a calcified pineal gland will look like. And calcification means that you have calcium kind of encapsulating the pineal gland. So let's start with a couple of scientific facts. Everybody is subject to calcification, and it generally starts already in childhood, and it varies a little bit by region, how you feed yourself, and there are various other circumstances, but 40% of the US population by the age of 17 has some form of calcification. That's a given. And it's a good one, because calcification is not always bad, because calcification has to take place during puberty, because the pineal gland is also instrumental in the development of the skeleton and reproductive organs. So if, said differently, if the pineal gland would not calcify, our skeleton would grow out of proportion. Now, over the course of time and post-puberty, it starts having an effect on the production of melatonin. And as we said earlier, melatonin is a principal hormone that facilitates sleep. Now, as long as you're healthy, it will not necessarily interfere with sleep, although people with comorbidities will start experiencing sleep problems. And actually quite recently, through the various neuroscientific studies, the calcification is linked to an acceleration of neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's and the like. And then from our other scientific sources, we learned that calcification is compromising the ability to connect spiritually. And what has gotten a lot of attention over the last, I would say, 5 years, mainly out of the behavioral sciences, is that calcification can cause a lack of comprehension, an increase in cynicism, jealousy, and pessimism. There were a couple of interesting clinical articles that I found where societal changes towards cross or sharp misalignment between people was attributed to an increase of calcification of the pineal gland in the population. So while we talk about calcification, we cannot escape the question of decalcification. There's a lot of bogus out there and around that, but what turns out is that fluoride is truly, and there is scientific evidence around that, is a major culprit in calcification. So obviously, one way to avoid it is drink RO water. There actually were some studies that are associated the use of fluoride in tap water with a growth of the human stature, meaning that if you look at over the span over the last 50 years, you see that our children are getting larger and larger. And so it's somewhat associated with, or thought to be associated with, fluoride. And then obviously, and I'm not going to give you here medical advice or dietary advice, but the literature reports that certain supplements help in terms of fighting calcification. One thing that is truly and tested and turned out to be a very effective means is chanting, or meditation and chanting. And particularly the chanting, because what you do is you vibrate the tetrahedron bone in the nose that stimulates the area in around the pineal gland, and particularly the Om seems to be a very effective way of doing that. So drawing this presentation to an end, we cannot escape the question of asking ourselves, why? I mean, for thousands of years, many civilizations have credited the pineal gland with some incredible things. One being, it's the gateway through which we connect to universe and God. Other is the seed of the human soul and the human conscience and thought. But there's, up until now, there is not really any reasonable explanation why and how does the pineal gland happen. And I want to offer some suggestions or some hypotheses, and these are not necessarily mine, but these are coming out of the scientific community. Well, one is, as we saw earlier, melatonin and serotonin regulate the secretion, and they have an effect on our sleep pattern. And we all know from our own experiences that if you had a good sleep at night, a good night of sleep, you obviously are able to function much better in the next day. However, there's also some studies that have found out that the pineal gland produces as well as reacts to DMT. Now, DMT is known as dimethyltryptamine, and is also due to be the spiritual molecule, which is a psychedelic. And let's take a look at that. So DMT in the form of a brew called ayahuasca was used for hundreds and hundreds of, if not thousands of years. And some might even argue for longer than that in shamanic practices. And its primary purpose was really healing bodily sickness, but also guiding in mental matters, in exploring religious experiences. And the way this used to be practiced is that the shaman would talk to the patient and basically would take the ayahuasca drink and would then subsequently connect with what they called the reality beyond. So in his kind of a journey, he would then connect either with nature or spiritual beings or gods, and would take then that feedback back to the patient as to what he needs to do in his behavior or what kind of medicines to take. And so that's kind of how this was practiced. Now, this whole concept of the DMT caught the attention by Dr. Rick Strassman, who was really fascinated by this and says, well, let me extract the DMT in a clinical pure form and conduct some really 21st or 20th century kind of a well-structured clinical studies. And he did this in New Mexico in 1990. I think he repeated that in 1995. And what came out of it is that the vast majority of the subjects indeed experienced a reality beyond the observable. And while it is a psychedelic, it was, people describe it as different from a psychedelic drug in that they talked about a reality. Also, what came out of that pretty much across the patient population, they said that they felt a presence of a cosmic conscience. And that cosmic conscience in their interaction was really intended to guide the individual or to guide mankind at large. Now, you might say that's all hogwash and are, junkies talk. Well, frankly, I need to remind you that these were people like you and I. Okay, so these were people that were, from various range out of the population, and these were not necessarily junkies. So I want to close now by kind of almost posing a question and quoting a neuroscientist that says that the pineal gland is really the last frontier in medicine. And hopefully, with the advancement in neuroendocrine sciences, it might reveal some of these mysteries of old that people for centuries and millennia have believed to be there. So, and with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I am open to answer some questions and entertain any form of dialogue and discussion afterwards. So, and I'll stop sharing here.
Thank you, Brother Hans, for that presentation. There was one question that came out about the RO. I'm assuming you mean reverse osmosis water.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, all right. So that's the answer to that question. Brothers, please go ahead, unmute and ask questions as you wish. I have posted the survey link into the chat, so please do that as well.
Yeah, Hans, I had a question more of a medical kind of nature. Two questions, actually. The pineal gland and kind of the whole concept of it being the eye. So does the pineal gland, I think from what I saw or read, that is explained that pineal gland has actual photoreceptors itself, right? So I was can you kind of just touch on again, how does it actually receive light? Does it connect directly to the eyes?
No, it does not have photoreceptors. The photoreception, so light are transformed into electrical impulses is actually happening in the eye. The electrical impulses are traveling to the pineal gland, and that's where it's being transferred. Now, having said that, there are several animal species where this is an exception. So some animals have actually photoreceptors are directly connected to the pineal gland. Certain snakes and certain reptiles basically have that.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. Yeah, because one of the studies I was reading was suggesting, as you were talking about, it's stimulated by light, that it is healthy when you wake up and the sun is just rising, and it's just not harsh, to do some sun gazing, just for a few seconds, kind of gaze while the sun is not at its peak.
Yeah, I had that in one of the recommendation genes, but I took that out because the last thing I want to achieve here is that people start staring into the sun.
Understandable, I get it. So, and then my second question was regarding around head binding. Did head binding, from what you understand, did it actually have the potential to increase the skull, or because to me, it's like Play-Doh, you just reshape it to seem longer, but the size of the skull stays the same, or the actual volume?
No, actually, you can extend it, or the skull, but the brain is not larger, or at least from what I have been able to ascertain is that the brain size does not change. You might have heard of the Arascas, the skulls in South America. So they did various scans there and measured the geometry, but frankly, the brain size was pretty similar. However, it did clear up the compression that the pineal gland has in modern skulls. So there might be some reality behind this whole thing, but I cannot speak to that. So. Well, we have a doctor online here, Bill. Any thoughts there?
Put him on the spot. He doesn't want to answer.
Yeah, on the spot. Well, I don't think cerebral volume changed much. I mean, there's a lot of binding that's been done. I mean, the Chinese bound feet, and it's interesting in Egypt. If you look at the Egyptian hieroglyphics, they went from a more standard head size to do the elongated ones. And then people said, well, maybe that was aliens coming in and doing something weird, and that's another discussion. But I do think it's possible. You know, when a child is born, they have fontanelles, and actually one of the things that physicians will do is when they see a baby, they'll put their finger on the junction of the fontanelles to see if it's bulging, and the fontanelles can be shaped. So a lot of plastic surgeons, if they have a deformed kid, will shape the fontanelles and do things. I don't think it changes cranial size, but it does change the phenotypic orientation.
Well, thank you. Any other, well, before we jump into other questions here, I'm going to wrap up with the the quick piece of the presentation here.
Can Bill try to explain that in a way that's easier to understand as far as reshaping the skull?
Have some plans, Billy?
Yeah.
So, okay, let me just say this, bones are very interesting. So when an infant has a fracture of a major bone in their leg, and it's casted appropriately, it'll regrow and reshape appropriately based on the stresses put on it. And similarly, you can do that with the skull, you can do that with the pelvis, you can do that with the feet, you can do that in a lot of ways. So bones respond to pressure put on them, which is a good thing if you had a fracture or something else is going on, but was used by the Egyptians to get the shape. I haven't studied why exactly they thought this was a good idea, but it's not surprising that this was relatively easy to do. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Are you saying doctors are shaping babies' skulls now?
Well, actually, in a sense, they are. So a big question is about, there's a huge idea about how you put your kids face down or face up and avoid infant death and so on. And one of the concerns is that when you put them on their backs, their skulls can shape. And so yes, babies' skulls do sometimes get kind of funny shapes, and doctors will address that with how they position them or with how they attach things to them to get the shapes to be more normal. So yeah, bones are slow growing but remarkably malleable in the right situation.
Awesome, thank you.
By the way, it was a great job, Hans. I signed in late, and I apologize for that. But the pineal glands is interesting because it's hard to get to, and I think what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years is now we have medical MRI imaging, where we can apply stimulus to people and see where in the brain it's reacting, and should come up with some very interesting insights.
Yes, thank you. As we talked earlier about the upcoming schedule, the webinar, or the survey for this webinar was posted into the chat. Please be sure to submit that survey before you leave.